Our scripture lesson for today comes again out of the book of Mark. That's where we were last week, and we're also in Mark this week because I'm once again using the lectionary text. And it comes out of Mark, the 4th chapter, looking at the 35th through the 41st verse. And I didn't ask anybody else to read it today, so I'm going to read it. So it's Mark, the 4th chapter, the 35th through the 41st verse. And it says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. A great gale arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, 'Why were you afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with great awe, and they said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" I want to talk for a few moments from the topic, peace, be still. "Master, the tempest is raging. The billows are tossing high. The sky is o'ershadowed with blackness. No shelter or hope is nigh. Carest thou not that we perish? How canst thou lie asleep, when each moment so madly is threatening a grave in the angry deep? The winds and the waves shall obey my will. Peace, be still. Whether the wrath of the storm-tossed sea, or demons, or men, or whatever it be, no water shall swallow the ship where lies the master of ocean and earth and skies. They all shall sweetly obey my will. Peace, be still. They shall all sweetly obey my will. Peace, be still." That's a powerful song by James Cleveland. It's an old song. It was my sister's favorite gospel song. It helped her through a very difficult season towards the end of her life and through those times of transition in her life. It's also a very timely song for us today, as we're now in the midst of hurricane season. You know, last year was one of the worst seasons for hurricanes. There were 21 named storms last year. There were so many storms that they ran out of names because, you know, they have a name for every name of the alphabet except for a few. But there were so many storms last year, they had to switch over to the Greek alphabet. It seems like every year it gets worse. It's predicted that this year there will be approximately 20 named storms, and 12 of those will be hurricanes. And out of those 12, it's predicted that 5 will be severe hurricanes. These storms have been destructive over the years. We've had some named storms, names that we won't forget. But some people, when they look at storms, they look at storms and they look at the fires and the things that seem to be getting worse and more numerous in our world and more severe. They start to talk about end times. We must be getting close to the end times. Well, I don't know about end times, but I definitely know it is time for us to listen to what's going on with our planet. You know, I've been talking so far about meteorological storms, but we all experience storms of different kinds. We have emotional, psychological, spiritual, economic storms, only storms that not only tear apart our homes, but and the trees, but metaphorical ones that tear right at our very spirit. I remember a few years ago, I looked at the cover of a Time magazine. It was after one of those powerfully destructive hurricanes. And the cover said, "The storms keep getting stronger, and so do we. The storms keep getting stronger, and so do we." After every devastating hurricane, we hear stories of survival, often because we're more prepared due to what we learned from the last storm. So the question is, what do you do to weather the storms in your life? When the winds start to blow and the seas start to get rough in your life, when, as the song says, so madly life is threatening, what do you do? Ralph Waldo Emerson said, the wise person in the storm prays not for safety from danger, but for deliverance from fear. It's the storm within that endangers us, not the storm without. So the question is, how do we manage storms that come into our lives? The scripture for today out of the Gospel of Mark gives us some ideas on how to manage our storms. We're talking about Mark, the same Mark we talked about last week, the one who tried to document the gospel or the good news that Jesus tried to share in his lifetime. Mark wasn't trying to put together a historical record, but Mark's gospel was almost like a sermon trying to get the message out. And it was a much needed message for the original audience, those Christians who were going through the storms of Roman persecution. They needed some encouragement. They needed some support. They needed something to tell them that they could hang on during the storm. So Mark wrote to them this story about Jesus and how Jesus and his inner circle of disciples, how they were out on this storm after they had just finished up a session of Jesus teaching to a large crowd. And after it was finished, Jesus got into a boat. Because sometimes when you minister to or help a lot of people, sometimes you feel drained and you have to get away. So Jesus got into a boat with his inner circle and they were going to go to another location. But the story says that while they're out on the sea, and it was probably really a lake, but while they were out on this water, a storm arose. And it must have been more than just a normal storm because all of the disciples, it said, were panicked. But some of them were fishermen, so they would have been in storms on the water before. So this one must have been really bad. It must have been like what we would say a category 4, a category 5 storm. Whatever it was bad enough for the disciples to get so worked up and so scared and so nervous that they went and woke Jesus up, because Jesus was asleep, not worried about the storm. The scripture said that when they woke Jesus up, he didn't freak out. He wasn't as afraid as they were. He didn't lose his mind because he was so centered that he was able to respond instead of just react. He surveyed the situation and realized that the problem was not the water, but the problem was the wind. And it was the wind that was making the water rough. So when he got up, he looked around and he rebuked the wind. He didn't get caught up in the water. He rebuked the wind, which was creating the conditions which was making the sea rough. So he was able to calm the water after he rebuked the wind. And he said to the water that was troubled, "Peace, be still." There's much we can learn about navigating storms that come into our lives. There's much that we can learn from this story. Like that Time magazine said, the storm keeps coming. But many of us have heard that cliche that says we're all either heading into a storm, in the middle of a storm, or heading out of a storm. Many of us, unfortunately, are heading towards storms in our lives, or maybe you're in a storm in your life. Meteorologists are sophisticated enough to forecast that there are going to be at least 20 named storms this hurricane season. And it even tells us which ones are going to be more severe. They can track tropical disturbances in advance and tell us that a storm is coming so we can be prepared. Wouldn't it be great if we could somehow have something like that who could predict and forecast the severity and the probability of our emotional, spiritual, and psychological or relational or economic storms in our lives so that we could be prepared? We don't have such warnings in our life. But there are a few things that we can learn from our text that could help us weather the storms that arise in our lives. The first thing, there are three things, and the first thing we can get out of this text is that we never know when a storm is going to come up. In our text, I'm sure Jesus and the disciples would not have pushed out onto the sea if they knew a storm was on the way, but they had no way to know. Similarly, as we push out on this thing we call life, we never know when the storms are going to come. We never really know when there's going to be a health challenge. We don't always know when there's going to be an economic issue like a job loss. We never know when there's going to be the loss of a loved one. We don't always know when there's going to be an emotional or a spiritual or psychological issue that arises in our life. And we sure don't know when there are going to be relationship troubles with our loved ones, whether it's an intimate relationship, a relationship with friends, a relationship with family, a relationship with our coworkers. We never know when there's going to be relationship trouble. But we can know where to go when these things arise. See, the disciples in our story knew they could turn to Jesus. So they went and they woke him up. You and I also need to know we have somewhere we can go when the storms of our lives hit. Hopefully, we have family and friends we can depend on. But even if we do not, as Emerson tried to tell us, it's the storm within that needs to be stilled, not the storm without. We need to know we have somewhere we can go to keep ourselves anchored in the middle of the storms in our lives. What do I mean? I mean, we need to be able to do things like, remember, we have the power of prayer. We can pray when we go in the middle of our storms. We can use affirmations in the middle of our storms. I know when I used to fly, there's something about the Northeast corridor where we used to always run into rough weather. And it was horrible. And I used to be really afraid of flying. And I used to say this mantra to myself, this affirmation, that I am protected, I am loved, and I am in God's care. And I would say it over and over and over again while that light was on to keep your seatbelt fastened, because I knew that I could cover myself with the reminder of God's love, that no matter what was going on, whether even if the plane went down, I was in God's care. You can have prayer, you can have affirmation, you can also do meditation. Some of us do what we call centering prayer, which is just like meditation, where you find some place, you get quiet and you look within. Some of us don't like going to that quiet place within because we don't like the thoughts that come up while we're in that place. But there's nothing inside of you that should scare you enough that you don't want to go there. Because even in your own spirit, you're never alone. God is with you. I've learned, though, along the way, because when you meditate, some people don't want to do it. They say they can't do it because they say their brain keeps thinking. Well, your brain is going to keep thinking, and things are going to come up. But the thing is to recognize it and kind of let that thought pass by. Don't get caught up in it. Don't try to figure it out. Know that you're trying to clear your mind and you're trying to clear your spirit and you're trying to get centered. You can do it. But the key is when the thoughts come up, just let them float by. Like Jesus in our text, just know that the Spirit of God is always with you, no matter what's going on. The second thing we can remember is don't get caught up in somebody else's drama. Don't get caught up in other people's drama. Imagine if when the disciples woke Jesus up and he saw the storm and he saw they were freaking out and he freaked out too, what would have happened? They all would have died because there would have been nobody there who was centered enough and was calm enough that could hold things down during a difficult time. Unfortunately, sometimes if you're not a drama queen, though, people think you're aloof or that you don't care. That's why the disciples say, don't you care that we're going to perish? No, sometimes you have to keep centered. It's important to remember the word responsibility. You know how we break it down, that it means responsibility, the ability to respond. You need to be centered and ready to respond. I remember when I was younger and my sister was a new mother, and I remember walking past the bedroom, and I heard her making this like crying noise, like a whimpering, quiet scream. And I looked in the room, and she was standing there holding her baby, my nephew. And the baby was like turning this strange color of reddish purple, and the baby wasn't breathing. And so I just went in and I grabbed the baby out of her arms. And I have to admit, if you've seen the movie Moonstruck, you know what I'm talking about. But I took the baby out of her hands and I patted the baby on the back and I turned to her and I relived that scene, snap out of it, because that baby did not need her to panic. The baby just needed to clear its throat, needed somebody to pat it on the back, to pick it up and and let it know it was going to be okay. But if she was panicking, she couldn't care for the baby at that time. I'm not saying that my sister was wrong. That's how we all are at different points in our life, where we get into a situation and we don't know what to do and we get frozen for a minute. But that's why we need to not get caught up in the drama of a situation. We need to be able to be clear-minded and be able to say, here's a situation. I've got to handle it. I've got to take care of it and not get stuck in it. Now, I wasn't trying to be abusive to my sister. I was trying to help her out of that space that Emerson talked about, that we don't need to have freedom from the situation. We need to have freedom from our fears. We especially need to know that we need an ability to stay calm. We need to be thoughtful and centered. You know, we especially need to know this now because we live in a time of conspiracy theories and lies. And sometimes you can hear stuff, and if you don't stop and think through it, then we can get so mesmerized and so traumatized by what we think we hear that we can't move forward. Like some of us have really gotten frozen by these voter suppression tactics that we're seeing and these cultural wars that we're seeing. Yes, these are serious issues that we need to work through, but we don't have to just react. We need to prepare and respond. We need to be able to plan. Like I've been saying that we need to, instead of getting stuck just saying, ain't it awful about the voter suppression tactics, we need to be planning. What can we do to work against it? How do we get more people to the polls? How do we make sure everybody's registered? How do we outnumber the people, the numbers that they're trying to disenfranchise? So we need to never get stuck in the ain't it awfuls of life. We need to get clear about what's going on around us, but we have to be ready to respond. And the third and final thing I want to talk about is every storm presents us an opportunity to evolve. Storms can cause tremendous amount of damage. Often homes are damaged or destroyed and people have to rebuild. But what I'm always struck by is a lot of times when we go through these damaging things physically in our lives, like if our home gets flooded or something happens, a lot of times when those things happen and we have to rebuild, even though the destruction wasn't planned, the rebuilding sometimes is better than what we had before the destruction. Things change as we rebuild and as we repair. We may change a color. We may add a room. We may just decide that we didn't need what we had before at all, and we do something completely different. Similarly, after the storms in our lives, we can choose to grow and change through our experiences. We can be different on the other side. We can make a choice that we want to brighten things up. We want to change things up. We want to make it more efficient. We want to do more with our lives than what we were doing before that storm hit. Like that cover said, the storms are getting stronger, and so are we. You know, in terms of meteorologically, we are more prepared for these storms that we experience in terms of hurricanes. We're prepared because we know when the storms are coming and we know they're going to come. And we can be prepared because we've learned some things through the past storms. In our emotional life, our psychological life, in our spiritual storms, life is going to get rough. We might even have some category 5 storms in our life, but they will not take us down. They don't have to take us down because we're more prepared. We're more prepared to handle those things. We have handled storms in our lives in the past. I'm going to invite you to do something with me for a moment. Close your eyes. Yes, really close your eyes. Now remember a storm in your life. Remember a period of your life that was really a rough time, a storm that you didn't know how you were going to get out of. Remember how bad it felt. Remember how afraid you were. Now open your eyes. Open your eyes to the reality that you made it through that storm. As bad as it was, you got through it. You're on the other side of it. And I bet you learned something. Either you decided, I'm never going to do the things that had led me in that direction in the first place, or I'm going to do something so I'm more prepared, or I'm going to heal a part of me that got damaged through that storm. No matter what, we are in a better position. The storms kept getting stronger, but so did we. And you're stronger and you're better because of some of the things you've been through. I'm not saying it was a good thing, but what I'm saying to you is you can handle it. So the next time when a storm comes into life, we can be like Jesus on that boat. We can get up, we can notice something happen, but then we can say, peace, be still. Thank you for listening.